more insight into the legal and business implications of Maduro's capture. We're joined by Richard Farley, Herbert Smith Freehills Kramer partner. Richard, the tease for you was that you say there's a lot of opportunity here. Yeah. It's huge. But as a lawyer, I'm sure you're concerned about, the rule of law, the political stability of the country, and
that's a big issue here in terms of making that opportunity a reality, right? You've had 27 years of Chavez, Maduro, most would say mismanagement of the economy, to put it kindly, and not exactly a traditional stable rule of law where people are just going to jump in and start making investments. So that all has to be established, and what's happening on the ground is very important, right? When the guys with guns are not going to court but shooting the dissenters in the street, it's a long way away from people deploying hundreds of billions of dollars. Now the opportunity, and Charles Myers of Signum had a note saying he thinks it's $750 billion over the next 5 years if things can go according to an optimistic view. But you got some complications, right? They're in default on their sovereign debt since 2017. And if you look at what the analysts are saying, they think the principal is going to have to get written down by half or perhaps more in order to have sustainability. So that has to get resolved. You also have a lot of contracts with oil and minerals and other aspects of the economy with China. Now, are we going to honor those contracts? Are we going to try to abrogate them? What are the consequences of that going to be? I think that's going to take time, and it's going to be very complicated.
What would the consequences be if the U.S. decides in all of this that it imposes its will, and in the capital stack of who gets paid first and the debt and the contracts that are being honored, that China just gets wiped out? What does that change if that's the decision that the U.S. presses for? Well,
you have courts around the world where those claims can be challenged, and reordering the capital stack can be challenged. And you also have, at the same time you're doing that, you're going to be asking the IMF and others to come in and have a plan, and have the private sector also adopt that plan. And, it's easy to say we're just going to make sure you don't get paid. It's harder when the assets of the American government and private companies are located around the world where China can come in and make claims. If they say the U.S. improperly reordered our claims, they may try to seize our assets.
How important, by the way, Richard, is the Southern District of New York in this? How important is the Maduro trial, or is it a sideshow to, the real story playing out?
Yeah, look, I think it's important because ultimately this is going to go in front of a jury, right? And think of the complications if he's acquitted, which is not, impossible. Juries do all kinds of things. What happens then? Does he get released? Does he go back? Does he have a personal damages claim against the U.S. government? I mean, there are all sorts of things here that are unsettled.
You know the judge, right, Hellerstein? He is the same judge, I think he's 92 years old,
yep,
who oversaw the Bill Wang case.
Yep.
And he was pretty spicy in that case.
Yeah, look, he's a very experienced judge. He's a Clinton appointee, not really viewed as being hyper-political. So I think he's going to play it right down the middle of the fairway.
But with all these uncertainties, it gets back to where we started. How, as a company, would you take a punt on helping to rebuild Venezuela and helping to rebuild this oil infrastructure with all these question marks hanging?
Here's what you need, okay? You need a stable political environment on the ground, which means rule of law, which means a government that's functioning. Okay, you need to have the debt restructuring moving along, right? And you have to have the support of the people who are going to be key players in the economy, which includes the unions, which for a long time have been very left-wing. So there's going to have to be a lot of things that fall into place. Now, I tend to think that greed trumps ideology over the long term. So I think when the people on the ground are convinced that we're serious about making the investment, and the government's going to facilitate that investment, and the people with the guns say, hey, we can actually make some money here, it may turn around in a positive way, but there's no guarantees.
I wonder what you think about Ricardo Hausmann from Harvard argues in The Economist that they need to first ensure stability, democratic stability.
Well, those two things are not necessarily the same, right? You can have stability that's not democratic.
That's fair. That's fair. But his point is that you need to have the will of the people behind an economic development program, and he's an economic development professor at Harvard. However, we were talking with Marco Papich of BCA Research earlier this morning. He said he doesn't agree. He thinks you can first ensure economic development or, investment, for example, in the oil infrastructure there, and then go to a democratic transition.
Yeah, look, ideally you would get first the military behind you. Then you would get the elites and those who know how to run things behind you. And then you have the popular, in terms of a democratic government. Now, all those things can happen simultaneously, but the first key is obviously getting the military to go along with what your plan is, and the elites who have the know-how and the capital on the ground to run things. And hopefully at the same time, you can get a democratic process. Now, they did have an election recently, and they did have a winner of that election. I don't know whether at the end of the day that's going to be the horse that the Trump administration rides. Time will tell.